Today we have a crazy revenge story of burning a farm. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, I poured tomato sauce all over my stepmom's wedding dress. As a child, I watched a TV show about a girl whose teacher became her stepmother. I felt bad for the poor little girl. She had lived with a teacher she never even liked. Little did I know that years later, it would be me in those shoes. The only difference was that I liked my teacher, but only as a teacher. I was not prepared for her to become my stepmother. I used to tell my dad about my favorite teacher. She taught English in my school and let me read all the texts because she enjoyed how I read. But my dad never met her. He didn't meet her until years later when I was in junior high. She no longer taught me, but I still saw her around and said hello whenever that happened. With a big smile on her face, she would sweetly say hello to me too. And sometimes, she would give me a big hug. I was in the school's parking lot waiting for my dad to pick me up after school when he met her. My dad had promised me earlier that day that we'd go out for lunch. I've always lived with my dad, but he was a very busy businessman and would be away for days and sometimes even weeks. I told him that I hated that he was absent, and he promised that we'd spend time together after school hours. I remember being so happy when I saw my dad pull up to my school's parking lot in the sickest car ever. Dad has always been a fan of beautiful, expensive cars. I was about to get into my dad's car when I saw the teacher I liked. She was in her car trying to get it started. I said hello to her and then asked my dad to do the same, telling him that she was the English teacher I liked. He got out of his car to say a proper hello to her and asked if she was fine. She said her car wouldn't start, and Dad asked what she'd like to do. She said she would have it towed the next day but needed a ride home for the time being. Dad then offered to give her a ride. She thanked him and got in the car with us. I wasn't uncomfortable with my dad offering to give her a ride. I just wanted to go back home, shower, step into a beautiful nice dress, and eat out with my father. While we drove to her house, she and my dad started to talk about different stuff. They talked about work, me, and they discussed me as though I wasn't even there, and then they talked about an old movie they both liked. When we got to her house, my dad asked if she was married, and she blushed and said she was divorced. My dad said, "Well, so am I." And I nearly got sick. I was old enough to know what was going on, and self-aware enough to know that I didn't like it. My dad took her number and we drove home, but for the most of our dinner, my dad only wanted to talk about her. Again, I'm going to say that I liked my teacher. She was the sweetest teacher ever and was even sweating after I left her class. She was, however, a very strict person. Many of the students did not like her for that reason. She was strict with her rules and even stricter with the punishments attached to these. And no one could ever talk to her about lowering the punishments or whatever, not even the principal. She could also be mean to students and make snide remarks about them. The thing about her was if she didn't like you, she'd go all the way in communicating her dislike. And if she liked you, she'd go all the way in communicating that too. And boy, did she dislike many people. It was so bad that we heard that the school board came after her for the nasty and mean comments she made to her students. Fortunately for her, some of the parents of the students she liked also liked her and still wanted her around, and that was how she was able to save her job. That evening when we returned home, before I went upstairs to my bedroom, I held my dad's hand and begged him to please not try to date my teacher. He rolled his eyes and said he was trying to date her. Let me also add that at the time, my dad had a girlfriend. He was in a relationship with a young, beautiful, upcoming actress, but I wasn't seeing her as often as I used to. I suspected that they had broken up, but I just didn't ask him. I asked my nanny instead and she said they'd broken up. She knew it wasn't going to last anyway. My dad was too old for her. About my nanny, my dad employed her when I was 4, and I've loved her since. She was like a big sister. She started as a teenager who was employed to babysit, but was soon employed full-time by my dad. She gave me great advice on school and friendships and also watched me whenever my dad was away. We had a great relationship. I started to notice that my dad went out more on evenings. He never told me where he was going, but my nanny was sure that he went on dates. One night, while my dad and I ate dinner, I asked if he had been going out on dates. He said yes, and then I asked if it was with his girlfriend, the one I knew. He said they'd broken up and that he'd met someone new. I just knew at that moment that it was my teacher. I don't know how I knew, but I did. I asked when I could meet her, and his response was, "When the time is right. We want to make sure we are sure about this." That just sounded like something my teacher would say. I was not shocked, not even in the least, when some months later, my dad said he wanted me to meet someone, but he wanted me to guess who she was. I already had a strong feeling it was my teacher, so I just guessed it was her. When I mentioned her name and my dad's face lit up, I knew it was over. My dad was in love with her, and it annoyed me. I liked my teacher, but not enough to want a personal relationship with her, especially one that involved dating my father. Even when I was failing math and needed a private math teacher, my dad was going to employ one of the math teachers in the school, but I vehemently disagreed with him. I just didn't want a teacher in my house. That was going to be too awkward. Things may never get serious, my nanny comforted me when I told her about my worries. She was wrong. Things got serious very fast, and before long, she and my dad got engaged. My nightmare began when my dad said she was going to move in. I was too shocked to even say anything. Please note that while I had my reservations about my teacher and my dad's relationship, I was never disrespectful to her, nor did I ever tell my dad that I didn't approve of the relationship. She'd come over for dinner once and we had a good time. I wasn't exactly excited to see her, but I wasn't mean or disrespectful either. We'd also all gone out together once and I remained a good girl. When my dad, however, told me that she was going to move in, I panicked, and my dad saw how terrified I was. He did all he could to allay my fears. He swore that she was a good woman, and even mentioned that she had a master's degree in child psychology. I was not interested in her educational qualifications, though. When she moved in, it was too weird for me. I avoided her as much as I could, but she wasn't comfortable with that. She tried to talk many times and initiate some kind of arrangement where we would be together, but I refused. One day, my nanny told me that she might be quitting her job and leaving. I was devastated. I was still trying to get used to my dad's fiance living in our house, and now my nanny was leaving. I burst into tears. She wasn't just my nanny, she was my friend and big sister. She refused to tell me why she was leaving, but when I cried and mentioned how she was leaving because nobody wanted me and my mother left me too, she told me the actual reason. My nanny had asked my dad's fiance to let her go. She said the reason I was not connecting with her was because I had my nanny. I begged my nanny not to go and even promised to fight to make sure she stayed, but she refused. She said she wanted to go to fashion school and was going to leave anyway. I was mad. I asked my dad about it and he tried to defend her. I just let them be. My nanny leaving was too much for me. I had a panic attack the night before, and when she left, it was like a big part of me had been taken away. We kept in touch anyway. She called me nearly every day and I had my best friend, but I was still mad at my dad's fiance. I knew my nanny was going to leave eventually, but if she hadn't heard their conversation, she wouldn't be leaving that soon. My dad and his fiancée planned to have a big wedding. They had both gotten their first marriage wrong and wanted to do it right this time. My dad's fiancée was especially interested in making it all a success. She wanted a wedding that would impress her friends and the other teacher. She wanted to make them jealous. Her wedding dress was nothing short of beautiful. She went all out for that dress, and it was perfect. I had already planned to get my revenge on their wedding day. I imagined something dramatic, maybe getting up when the priest asks if anyone is against their marriage, or throwing a big tantrum. When I told my nanny about it, she warned me never to do that. "Your father will never forgive you," she'd said to me. I understood that. The day before the wedding, I did something a little more subtle. While my stepmother-to-be and her friends were in the living room having a very PG bachelorette party, I sneaked into her room and her closet. Then I poured tomato sauce all over it. The entire dress was ruined. I knew she could fix it, but it would take time, and the dress would not look as good as it was intended after being laundered. Yes, my stepmother accused me of being responsible, but I denied it. And my dad was mad that she would even think I did it. That caused problems in their marriage for the first 2 months, and that was how I got back at my stepmom for making my nanny leave. I mean, it's nice that after all that and OP clearly having objections the whole way that their father would think, "Oh, my innocent child would never do such a thing." But at the same time, it's like, who else could it have been? Also, hi, I'm Steven, and if you guys enjoy crazy stories of revenge, it would be amazing if you left a like or left a review if you're listening to my podcast. That said, our next story is how I ruined my uncle's marriage, but not in the way you think. I, female 21, got back at my uncle's wife, female 36, in the worst way possible. I broke up her marriage with my uncle, male 40, and I know this might seem a bit extreme at this time, but I promise you, every single action of mine is fully justified, and I did all of these as a means of retribution, just for all the times I'd been wronged in my life, of which a large percentage of is the fault of my uncle's wife. She wasn't ever kind to me, and I still don't have any idea as to why this was so, as I knew she had children too and she loved them greatly, with all her heart. But when it came to my case, she always had something terrible in store for me, and I'd been living with her and my uncle under these conditions for years until I could no longer, and so I decided to get a place for myself with the help of my uncle, by the way, and before I left, I made sure that things would never be the same between my uncle and herself, because this was my way of paying her back, and it ultimately paid off. What I did practically ended their marriage, and I don't regret it one single bit. Ever since I was little, I'd always been fond of my uncle, as he was always there for me. Both my parents were work-oriented and they rarely had enough time for themselves, let alone enough time for me, but thankfully I didn't lack love growing up, as he was always there for me. He would always make enough time to me on over, as my parents were rarely ever around. And he didn't feel quite comfortable leaving me to the care of the caretaker and all, so most times, he would always come to our house, take me out for a treat before taking me back to home. And he would also make sure to stay there with me right until the moment my parents came back home. If they did come back that very day. This went on for quite a while, and he made complaints on my behalf, trying to call them to order on their negligence, but this didn't really seem to bother them, and it didn't for me either, as I had everything I wanted. And I lacked nothing, as my uncle was always there for me. But when I truly felt his presence in my life was when the tragic incident happened with my parents on one of their business trips outside the country. Their flight encountered some turbulent activity at night, and the news the next morning was that there were no survivors. It really broke my uncle, but not as much as it did for me, because the most painful part of everything was the fact that I didn't even get the chance to properly get to know them, and also for them to fully realize their dreams, as they were both the most hardworking people I'd ever met in my entire life. And for the next few days, things were not the same for either one of us, as we both didn't know where we were going to go from that point on. Me especially, but this was when my uncle really stepped up, as he took me in and I've been living with him ever since. This was when I was only 9. Life without my parents was hard, but my uncle made sure that I wasn't too hung up on the past. And seeing as my parents had quite a bit saved up for my future, our finances weren't a problem. And just like that, my uncle had become the only parental figure in my entire life. And for this, I am truly grateful to and for him in my life. My uncle was still a bachelor at this time, and over the course of a few years, I got to see him go through a lot at the hands of women. And it was really hard to see this, but I was always there to cheer him up and basically be there for him the same way he was for me. However, everything soon changed a few years after I'd moved in with him, about 4 years since the passing of my parents. He had met someone, a single mother of one, who was at the time fully into him and was willing to make whatever it was that they apparently had work. I had my doubts about her at first because, first off, she was a very young mother, which means that she was probably irresponsible at a very young age, or she was just a victim of circumstances at such a young age, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions first off, and so I just decided to not voice out my thoughts at the time. Anyways, the one thing I'd come to realize from the whole meeting with her was the fact that through all my suspicions, she really was a good thing for my uncle. As for the first time of quite literally forever, I was seeing him very happy. So much so that it could put a tear on a grown man's face. He was able to experience things that apparently he didn't have the chance to experience before. And I really just liked only the effect, or rather the impact she was having in his life. She was literally pushing him to be a better version of himself, trying to make him realize his full potential and all. And this was what was really making me like the kind of person she was. Or so I thought. Little did I know that this quite literally was the beginning of everything wrong. After over a year and a half of dating, my uncle finally decided that it was time for the both of them to tie the knot, which would have been a first for him and her too, regardless of the fact that she already had a child and all, and there was no doubt about the fact that this was quite literally the happiest day of my uncle's life. I could literally feel the joy oozing out of him, and his wife too, Anyways, after the whole wedding, things were really going good for every single one of us. My uncle, myself, his wife, and her child, whom I don't have the slightest ounce of affection for some weird reason by the way. Then about 2 whole years into the marriage, this was when her true colors were already beginning to show. It all started when I'd finally graduated from high school, and at the time, in an attempt to make judicious use of the funds my parents had left behind for my education, I meant to apply for as many scholarship programs as I could find, and it was indeed a long and audacious process. I wanted to do this as a means to at least save up that money and use it for something else in the future, as it was just sitting at the bank, accumulating interest all these years and all. I informed my uncle of my plans prior to before they fell through, and he was in full support, but also tried to assure me that there was no problem if I wasn't able to get the scholarship as planned, and that he would still support me either way. I was really happy to know that he had my back. His wife, on the other hand, was a different case. As a parent, she was of the notion that the money left behind by my parents were somewhat hers, as she felt entitled to it, seeing as she was my uncle's wife and all. On several occasions, she even tried to get him to forego ownership rights and just use it for their family. That is, my uncle, his wife, and her child. And of course, every single time he turned her down at every turn. And this was what usually caused problems between the both of them. This was until the moment I heard from my uncle that he'd just been offered a position at his place of work, and he was amongst a chosen few to attend a whole year seminar program, and that he couldn't bring more than a person of his choice, all expenses paid. I really wanted to go at the time, but then this was when his wife was trying to ascertain her position as his wife, and forcefully tried to force my uncle to take her. My uncle could visibly see the tug of war that we were engaging in over the ticket, and as he didn't want the both of us fighting over anything, he simply concluded that this was not something he would want to come between any of us, and so he went with his best friend. When he made this decision, I was totally okay with it, as I didn't want to be the only one left out. And I'm guessing neither did his wife, but that was no concern of mine, as if I were going, neither was she. I was okay with this, but I guess she wasn't. And I only got to find out later on in the most miserable way possible. When my uncle left for his business trip, his wife completely had a whole different personality switch up, which came with emotional torture and some touches of physical abuse here and there, at least 3 times every week. She would starve me on some days, almost weeks. There was even the one time where I went for 5 whole days without eating, and while I was on the verge of passing out, that was when she finally brought me food. One day, almost about 5 months since my uncle had been gone, I asked her why she was being this way with me, and her response really got me furious. But I had thought there was nothing I'd done at the time. She said that she hated the fact that my uncle apparently had more feelings of love and affection for me than he did for her and her child combined, and she was always looking for a means to get rid of me, but I was just persistent. This was all in her words. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was someone that I thought was perfect for my uncle. Little did I know what kind of person she was, but I soon got my chance to get back at her, as I got the chance to contact my uncle after she had left the house one day, leaving behind her phone. When my uncle called, I picked up the phone immediately and I poured out everything I was feeling and all that had happened. He was extremely furious as he never tolerated anyone treating me badly ever, and this feeling became stronger after my parents' passing, and to him, she had crossed the line. He wanted to come immediately, but I told him not to come at that time, and that I wanted him to catch her red-handed, maltreating me, and then I got an even more perfect opportunity. Apparently, she'd been seeing another man since my uncle had been away, and that very night when my uncle had already flown in and was patiently waiting for my call, I realized that this was the perfect opportunity to ruin everything she had with my uncle. When she and the guy she came to the house with had gone inside the master bedroom, I immediately called my uncle, and we both waited for them to be done in the living room. When she came out, the look on her face when she realized how messed up everything had gotten so fast was priceless. But what was even all the more priceless was the fact that I was grinning from ear to ear, as visibly as possible. And as she saw my face, I could tell that she knew what I had done. The marriage between the both of them ended as quickly as you can say chocolate biscuits, and within the next few months, the divorce was finalized, and just like that, she was out of mine and my uncle's life. I mean, she kind of played herself in the situation, not going to lie. I mean, is it really nuclear revenge if you catch a spouse cheating with another person and then exposing them or, calling it out? I mean, she was the one that blew this thing up from the get-go, cheating. Our next story is, I burnt my evil neighbor's farm. Just 3 months after my graduation from college, I, 23-year-old male, received a call from my dad, telling me to come back home to help out on the farm. That had to be one of the most heartbreaking calls I'd received in a while. As I said, I had just finished college and I was already looking into prospective companies to submit an application for internships. I hadn't gotten any replies, but I was optimistic. I had this whole idea of how my life was going to be after college, and in all my daydreams, none of them involved going back to the countryside and helping out on the farm. But then my dad complained about the workload and not being able to pay any outside help, because he was barely making any money to keep the farm afloat. I'd always felt guilty for the problems my dad was facing on the farm. It was mostly because he spent a lot of money trying to get me the best education without owing too much in student loans. I couldn't say no. After saying goodbye to my friends, I traveled back to the countryside to be with my parents. I hadn't been home in 4 years since I left for college. My family home was thousands of miles away from my school, and it was very inconvenient and expensive to come home for the holidays. Besides, I hated the countryside. There was nothing to do there. Most of my friends in high school had moved to the city and I didn't have a lot of people to talk to. Anyway, I got home and saw my parents for the first time in 4 years. We talked and caught up with everything that had happened in my school, and after that we talked about the farm. At first, all they said was that it was going great and that they just needed the extra help till they could get enough money to hire a permanent farmhand. But with the way they talked and shared weird looks among themselves, I knew that there was something they weren't saying. Besides, while the cab was driving down to the house, I noticed that the corn farm looked scanty and browner than usual. When I told them about this, they finally fessed up. They said that the crops hadn't been growing well for some time, and no matter what they did, the plants always came out looking stunted and unhealthy. We went out to the farm to check things out. Everything looked fine and I couldn't figure out what was going on. Then my dad said that he was planning on working harder on the farm and giving it some extra care. That was why he called me home, and if that didn't work, he'd have no choice but to sell it to our neighbor next door. The neighbor I used to know before I left for college was an old woman, Mrs. Helen, and there was no way she was the one buying the farm. I asked my dad about it, and he told me that Mrs. Helen had died a year ago and someone else had bought her place. His name was Alan, 51-year-old male, and he was the one interested in our farm. I didn't think much of it, and so we returned back to the house. Shortly after I settled in my room, my mom came to call me, informing me that we had a visitor. When I asked who, she replied that it was our neighbor Alan. There was something about the way she said it that made me realize that she wasn't pleased about the fact that he was here. Curiosity took over, and I left the room to see what was going on. I went downstairs into the kitchen to see my dad seated and talking to the man. My dad introduced me, and Alan quickly walked over, shaking me and talking to me as though we'd known each other for years. He was so cheery, and to any other person, he looked like some harmless do-gooder. But I've come to learn that if a person is cheery and all smiles with you, there's a high chance they're hiding something from you. I don't know if it's the trauma of being betrayed by some friends in college or just my normal distrust for people, but I felt like there was something off about him. I didn't say anything though. I just sat there, replying to him as he asked me a billion questions about my college. When he was done, he turned to my dad and asked about the farm's well-being. My dad complained about the poor state of the plants and vegetation and said that he didn't know what to do. Alan raised the issue of wanting to buy the farm, and I looked at him. Something wasn't adding up. Alan could clearly see that we were struggling with the farm. Why would he want to buy it? I asked him immediately and he waved it off, saying he had a hunch that he could run the farm better than we were doing. I didn't stop there. I pressed further by asking him what he planned to do differently if he was running the farm. But all he said was that he couldn't reveal his strategies because even though he was friends with my parents, they were still a competition. After he left, I turned to my dad and asked him how he became friends with that jerk of a neighbor. He explained that he bought the farmhouse after Mrs. Helen died, and since then he's been coming over to say hi. He had talked to my dad about selling the farm to him countless times, but my dad had declined. A few days later, I was bored out of my mind at home. I had done the necessary chores on the farm and I didn't feel like watching a movie, so I decided to take a walk. Since I got back, I hadn't had time to see how the town had changed, so I went out. After walking past our farmland, I got to the next house, which used to be Mrs. Helen's. She used to have farmlands, but since all of her sons moved to the city for work and she got old, she abandoned them and stayed home. The farms had always looked barren and deserted, but today, they looked all green and full of life. I was so surprised at this change, and I contemplated going to the house and asking Alan about his secret to healthy crops. But according to what I'd heard from my parents, there was no use because he won't divulge his secrets. As I walked further into the town, I noticed that every other farm was doing well. Everyone except my parents. When I returned home, I had thought that it was the whole town that was having this bad experience with the crops, but as it turned out, it was only ours. I decided to hire a soil technician to tell us what was going on. When he tested the soil, he reported that it had high salinity. This meant that the salt content in the soil was high, and that was why it was difficult for the plants to grow because it hindered the soil's ability to take in water and nutrients. It was difficult and expensive to reduce the soil's salinity, but very possible. So we started the journey. I remember asking the soil technician about the soil salinity and how it was possible that it was affecting only my parents' farm. He gave a few reasons that didn't apply to us before eventually saying that it could be possible that we'd been using salt water on the farm. My dad said it was impossible because it was the same water we drank at home, so we would have noticed if it contained salt. But then I remembered that the farm had a different reserve tank, and so we decided to check just to make sure. Mom got a glass from the house and we got some water directly from the farm's reserve tank. To our utmost shock, we discovered that the soil technician was right. The water was saturated with salt. We returned to the house and discussed the situation. There was no way salt could have gotten up into the tank if someone hadn't poured it in, and according to the technician, it had to have been happening for a long time because the salt in the soil eventually disappears, and the salt had to be consistently replaced to keep the crops unhealthy. We made a list of all the people my parents had problems with, everyone in town who might want to retaliate in this manner. The list was pretty short because my parents were good people and were loved by almost everyone. As I looked through the list, Alan's name popped up in my head. Even though my parents were cool with him, he also had a reason for not wanting the business to succeed. He wanted to buy the farm, and there was no way my dad would have sold if there wasn't anything wrong with the farm. And just like that, Alan jumped to the top of our suspect list. We still had to prove that he was responsible, so I ordered some motion sensors online and installed them around the farm and close to the tank. We put it on at night when it was time to go to bed because that was the obvious time a person wanting to cause some mischief would strike. On the fourth day, the alarm was triggered and I woke up to check who the culprit was. I turned out to be right, and I saw Alan standing on a ladder and pouring a bag of salt into the tank. It was late in the night and I couldn't take a clear picture or video of him that could be used in court. I couldn't assault him physically either because I'll end up in a cell along with him. My dad wanted to call the police and report the case to them, but I had other plans. If we reported him, he'd pay a fine and that'll be the end. I, on the other hand, wanted to ruin him, so that's what I did. One afternoon, I got my parents to invite him for lunch so they could discuss the sale of their farm. I joined them for lunch, but I only stayed for the first 5 minutes before returning to my room. I sneaked out of my house through my room window. I'd done this a million times as a teenager, so it wasn't a problem. I went to the shed beside the house, where I'd already prepared a few gallons of gasoline. I rushed over to Alan's farm and poured gasoline in his house, barn, and farm. I made sure to douse all his mechanical equipment in enough gasoline to burn to ashes. He was divorced and lived alone, so there wasn't anyone in the house. I made sure to get to a safe distance before lighting the matches and setting everything on fire. I didn't even bother watching the whole thing burn. I climbed back the way I came from and went to shower to get the smell of gasoline off me. I stayed in the room and pretended to play my game. When the smoke started to blow into the house, I went downstairs to alert them that something was going on. We all went to Alan's farm and watched as the fire burnt everything he owned. It took 2 fire trucks and hours of work to finally put off the fire, but by that time, everything was burnt to the ground. I didn't leave any evidence of the arson, and even if I did, the fire destroyed everything. The investigators didn't even know who to point fingers to, because apparently he wasn't well liked in town. Almost everybody had a bone to pick with him. Eventually, Alan had to move. The money he got from his insurance wasn't enough to cover the repairs, and because some people were making rumors about him starting the fire himself, he wasn't able to secure a substantial loan from the bank. He eventually had to sell the property at a discounted price and moved away from town. Just a few months after he left, my parents' farm started flourishing and all was right in the world again. Well, I can't say that going and burning down somebody's farm is the right way to handle justice. But if you found out that somebody was intentionally ruining your parents' property trying to strong-arm them into giving them a great deal for their land, and you found out what this person did to get revenge for it, you probably wouldn't rat them out, right? Well, maybe. I don't know if you want to be complicit in it either. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another absolutely crazy revenge story, check out that video on the left. Or if you missed my latest video, check out that video on the right. That said, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.